Hello everyone, I wanted to do some more chapters out of the book I Was a Doctor in Auschwitz by Dr. Gisela Perl. The Bag of Diamonds. The month of August 1944 covered the territory of Auschwitz with a heat wave never experienced before. The cruel Silesian sun was only one of the sources of heat, which, with a ruthlessness learned from the Nazis, burned deep wounds into our defenseless bodies. There was another source of heat somewhere outside the gates which sent a ripple of disquietude all through the camp. The crematories burned with a new fierceness, and the passionate dance of the flames registered excitement, discontent with what was happening outside. From morning till night we heard nothing but Block Speer, an order that meant curfew. The streets of the camp were empty, the doors of the blocks locked, and we spent our days as well as our nights in the fetid darkness of the barracks, a prison within a prison. We knew only too well what this Block Speer meant. The thin walls could not keep out the whistling of the trains, and trains to us meant new cattle cars filled with victims, new fuel for the never-ending crematories. Yet, there was something mysterious, something new and unexpected about this abundance of victims. We, Hungarian Jews, who had spent many long months in this antechamber of death, could not quite understand it. We had believed that the Hungarian Jews were the last ones in Europe to be rounded up for extermination. Some of the doctors, myself among them, were exempt from the curfew. In the transparent air of the August mornings, we could see the columns marching from the train to the gates, well-dressed ladies, smart little boys and girls, each with his small bundle containing God knows what treasures. They marched soundlessly, not knowing yet what was in store for them. Suddenly, I noticed a group of nuns in the colorful columns, their starched headdresses still immaculately clean. Blows and the coarse laughter of SS men accompanied their steps, but they seemed not to notice. Behind them I saw men in some kind of a uniform, maybe trainmen. Behind them priests, and then again elegant ladies with queer big hats. Day after day they marched along the road as if the Nazis had decided to exterminate Europe to the last man, woman, and child. One day I saw a group of well-dressed, white-bearded gentlemen go by, fully dressed with hats and gloves and well-cut overcoats. They carried fine plaid blankets and small overnight cases in their hands, like diplomats going to some important conference. I stood there, not far from the gas chambers, watching them, suffering for them, already mourning them. I saw their worried faces, questions in their eyes, but the answer, even if I had been able to communicate it to them, would have only added to their despair. One of the old gentlemen looked exactly like my father, or was that only a fever-born illusion? They were Dutch Jews, I heard, rich people who had been able to hide until now, thanks to their money and connections. But nothing could save them from the Nazis bent upon exterminating the last remaining Jews of Europe. They were all burned to death quickly before they had time to face their fate. Only a very few came out of the selection alive, dressed in rags like the rest of us. A few days later I spoke to one of these newcomers. He worked on the refuse heap near the crematory. In that short time, the elegant, well-groomed man, who had looked like a diplomat, had become a dirty, lice-infected human wreck, his spirits broken. He was a Dutchman, and he spoke German. I saw him go over to one of the camp foremen and whisper to him under his breath, anxiously, hurriedly. The foreman looked at him expectantly, and the new prisoner reached under his rags and brought out a small leather pouch, the kind which usually holds tobacco. He opened it with trembling hands and shook the contents into his palm. Like a million little suns, the diamonds shone and sparkled in his dirty, broken-nailed hands. Grinning broadly, the foreman nodded and held out 3 miserable, uncooked potatoes, and the elderly man, shaking with impatience, tore them out of his hand and put them into his mouth, chewing, swallowing, as if every bite gave him a new lease on life. The little pouch full of diamonds already rested in the pockets of the foreman, and he kept his hand on it, caressing the stones almost tenderly. Here, in this stock exchange of hell, the value of a bag of diamonds was 3 uncooked potatoes, and this value was the real one. 3 potatoes had positive value. They prolonged life, gave strength to work, and to withstand beatings, and strength meant life, even if only for a short time. The bag of diamonds itself was good for nothing. For a while, a short while, it might delight the eyes of a ruthless murderer, but when the day of reckoning came, it would not save his life. The life-saving embryo. The SS kitchen was one of the busiest places in camp. The cooking and baking went on for 12 hours a day, meal after meal was served, and the SS men and women grew fat on the rich food taken from the bundles of the newly arrived victims of the crematory. Only Irma Gratze refrained from overeating so as to keep her lovely body lithe and attractive, for her future career as a movie star. She used to find a sadistic pleasure in putting all of my digestive glands to work by telling me about the meals she had and the ones she was going to have later. "We had real coffee with cream and sugar this morning," she would tell me, "and we ate Danish coffee cakes with raisins in them. The cook told me we are going to have roast loin of pork for dinner with browned potatoes and green vegetables." Her eyes never left my face while she spoke. There was a satisfied gleam in them as she noted the effect of her description. A few old, deserving Aryan prisoners were the cooks in the SS kitchen. Working under the supervision of an SS woman, the kitchen was the sanctum of the camp, heaven to the few prisoners who worked in it, and a mythical place to those who only knew about it. It was autumn, cold, wet, and hopeless. We remember dimly that there was a living world beyond the barbed wire fences, a world where people ate and drank and slept. Have they forgotten us? Have they forgotten this tremendous cemetery where only time separates the living from the dead? It was night, and I lay on the damp planks of my cot in the little operating room of our hospital, dreaming about the past, when suddenly I heard someone whisper in my ear, "Doctor, come with me. One of the kitchen superintendents wants to see you. You must examine her. Yes, I know, it is against the rules, but it is an order. Come, I'll lead you." We stumbled through the thick mud covering the ground, surrounded by complete darkness. Suddenly, I felt wonderful smells fill the air around me. Food, which a moment ago was a dream, became a reality. My eyes filled with tears of intense desire, and my usually dry mouth was wet with saliva. We entered the lighted kitchen. Gleaming, well-scrubbed pots and pans stood on the racks along the walls. There were shelves full of fine china, plates, saucers, cups, and dishes of various sizes. I breathed deeply of the rich smell of food which still lingered, hours after the last meal had been served. My eyes feasted on the sight of cleanliness and abundance, which looked like something out of my own past. What would I have given to possess one of those cups, one of those silver spoons? Even the foul turnip soup we were given day after day would have tasted better had we eaten it out of a plate with a silver spoon. But no use dreaming. These things were not for us. They were meant for our masters, the Nazis. My guide nudged me, and we entered the room beyond the kitchen. It was a lovely young girl's room in white and pale blue. Frilly curtains on the windows and a heavy pale blue silk spread on the bed. There were 2 comfortable armchairs and a writing desk, and in the middle of the room stood the SS woman who had sent for me, in a spotless white smock and high black patent leather boots. A short, crisp order: "Examine me. I think I am pregnant." I examined her and then straightened up. I begged to report that there is no pregnancy present, and as a proof I held up my hand which was dripping with blood. For a moment her face softened. For a moment she was a woman, glad that her fears were groundless. "You can go," she said. "Tomorrow morning you'll get a pail of potatoes from me, but take good care that you don't blab." On our way out again we went through the kitchen, and I could hardly refrain from touching the pans, the china, the glassware, the silver with a caressing hand. Then I was back on my cot to dream of potatoes for the rest of the night. Before dawn somebody touched my shoulder. It was the same prisoner who had taken me to the kitchen superintendent. In her hand she held a pail covered with rags, and in the pail were about 2 pounds of potatoes. I dared not believe my eyes. The SS woman had kept her word. Potatoes, real potatoes. I took them in my hands, one by one, lifted them to my nose, my lips, to feel their fragrance, their texture. They were real. Not only a figment of my excited imagination. A second later I had awakened the entire medical staff, the 4 doctors and 4 nurses, shifting my weight from one foot to the other with excitement. I told them about my treasure and how I had earned it. We were going to have a real dinner that night. We would get some water and boil the potatoes on the small iron stove of the hospital. Each of us had a different idea how to prepare them. One wanted to make paprika potatoes, the favorite dish of many Hungarians. The other wanted to fry them in fat. A third dreamed of baking them in their jacket. It took a long time before we quieted down sufficiently to make a realistic plan. We would peel them with our surgical knives and boil them in water. Never had the hours between dawn and dinner seemed as long as that day. Already a long line of sufferers stood in line before the hospital waiting for treatment, for bandages, for help. We hid the pail among the rags and went to work. I shall always remember that day. I had been ordered to interrupt a 2-month-old pregnancy and conserve the embryo in formalin. It was a difficult operation without instruments, without anesthesia, but fate was merciful to me and I succeeded in bringing out the 8-week-old fetus in one piece. It was a beautiful specimen, and I hurried to put it into the formalin jar to show it to Dr. Mengele later. The mother, happy to be through with it, returned to work. Her life was safe, at least for a while. My colleagues and I hardly spoke to each other in the rush of work, but when we did, our words concerning themselves exclusively with the potatoes. But we had to speak to our patients, as kind words were almost the only cure we had for their ailments. There were many broken bones to set, dog bites to cleanse, whip wounds to disinfect, and skin infections to be treated with the small amount of salve that we had. A few paper bandages and friendly words were all we could give these unfortunates, yet they liked to come. The hospital was the only place where they felt they could speak freely, remember their past, and make plans for their future. There was an illusion of security there, even though we all knew that disaster might bear down on us at any moment. Every afternoon, Dr. Mengele paid the hospital a short visit. We feared these visits more than anything else because he always found a reason to vent his sadistic fury on us, and we never knew whether we would be permitted to continue to live after. Once we were abused because there were too many sick in the hospital, once because there were too few. Once he almost beat us because we were too dirty. Another time he promised to have us cremated because we looked altogether too well kept. He was free to do whatever he pleased with us, beat us, whip us, kick us with heavy boots, or simply detach us to the crematory. That day he was late. The afternoon was over. We had stood the second roll call. Supper had been distributed. The stars were shining, and he still did not appear. He had never been so late before. We all told each other maybe he wouldn't come at all. We began to breathe more freely and started preparations for our sumptuous evening meal. One of us left the hospital to fight for water. Another went to gather little pieces of wood for our stove. A third walked down to the other end of the camp to beg a Polish woman who worked in the kitchen for some matches. I remained behind to sharpen our knives. A little while later we had everything we needed: water, wood, matches, knives, and all 9 of us sat down on the grimy floor to peel our heavenly potatoes. There was a deep silence within the walls of the hospital, not a sound except our occasional low-voiced words and the gentle sound of the knife as it touched the juicy flesh of the potatoes. Suddenly, a car stopped before the entrance. The door was flung open, and before we had time to recover, we saw Dr. Mengele's dangerous black-clad figure standing on the threshold. His mouth, with the sharp wolf's teeth, remained open with surprise as he noticed what we were doing. We were completely paralyzed by fear, and so were the 280 patients in the hospital behind us. The silence lasted only a second, and the storm, when it broke, was all the more terrible. He ran around like a wild beast, smashing everything in his way. He kicked over the stove, stamped on our potatoes, overturned the operating table, screaming, shouting incessantly, "Yes, this is how I imagined a Jewish hospital, you dirty whores, you unspeakable Jew swine." I knew that this was the end. My poor potatoes, which I had shown my friends with so much pleasure, had brought death upon us and our 280 patients as well. I was sure that none of us would escape, that we were all condemned to death. Suddenly I conceived a desperate plan. I got up from the floor, went to the shelf, took down the jar containing the fetus, and approached Dr. Mengele. "Herr Hauptsturmführer may be interested in this specimen," I stammered. "Only rarely is it possible to bring it out in one piece." He stopped raving and grabbed the jar out of my hand. His face, which a moment before had looked like the face of a raving maniac, assumed a cruel, satisfied smile. "Good. Beautiful. Take it to crematory number 2 tomorrow. We are sending it to Berlin." And as if he had forgotten what went on before, he turned around and left the hospital. We calmed down our hysterical patients the best we could, and without a further glance at the squashed potatoes, which almost caused our death, threw ourselves on our cots to dream of a world in which potatoes are a harmless vegetable for anyone to eat.